My name is Adiz. I am 67 years old, and I have lived in this house for 31 years. I raised my children inside these walls. I buried my husband from this front porch. I planted the rose bushes along the driveway with my own hands the spring after he passed, because I needed something living to tend to. This house is not just an address. It is every decision I ever made that mattered. So when I walked through my own front door on a Tuesday afternoon and found strangers moving through my living room like they owned it, I stopped in the doorway and stood very still. Two men in gray uniforms carried my late husband Gerald's antique writing desk toward the front door. The one I had refused to sell 3 separate times over the years because Gerald used to sit at it every evening after dinner and read. My jewelry box sat open on the side table, emptied, the velvet lining exposed. My mother's china, the set she brought from Nigeria when she came to visit us the year before she died, was stacked in newspaper on the floor. My daughter Sonia stood in the center of the room with a clipboard in her hand. She looked up when she heard me come in. Her expression did not change. She said, "Mom, we're simplifying your life." I was not sick. I was not moving. Nobody had asked me anything. I looked at her quietly and said, "What is this, Sonia?" She smiled the way people smile when they have already decided how a conversation will end. Just clearing out what you don't need anymore. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply stepped to one side and let the men pass with Gerald's desk. Because I had already noticed something she did not know I had noticed. The key hook beside the front door, where my spare house key had hung for 11 years, was empty. That night I moved through the house quietly, checking things the way you check things when you already suspect the answer. The spare locks on the back door and the side entrance had been replaced. Fresh silver hardware, still carrying that new metal smell. I ran my finger along one of the new deadbolts and said nothing. Sonia was in the kitchen making tea. Her husband Philip sat at my dining room table with his phone, not looking up. He had been that way all evening, avoiding my eyes with the careful consistency of a man who knows something he does not want to be asked about. I told Sonia the locks looked different. She said it was for my safety. Said the old ones were worn down and easy to pick. Said she had been meaning to do it for months. Said it like this was something a daughter naturally does for her mother. Thoughtful. Routine. Nothing worth discussing. I nodded and said thank you. Then I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while. I have always understood that the most dangerous situations are not the loud ones. The loud ones announce themselves. They give you time to step back and prepare. It is the quiet ones, the ones dressed in the language of care and helpfulness, that close around you before you realize they have moved at all. I was not confused. I was not declining. I was watching. Later from the hallway, I heard Philip's voice through the kitchen wall, low and certain. "The facility can hold the room if we confirm this week. His cousin's place. We just need to move." I stood in the dark hallway and listened to my future being scheduled without me. Then I went to my closet, reached to the back of the top shelf, and pulled down an old brown folder. The folder was not heavy. It held only a few documents, but they were the right ones. I had put them there 4 years ago, after a conversation with my attorney that I had never mentioned to anyone in my family. I sat at my bedroom desk with the folder open in front of me and read through everything slowly, even though I already knew what it said. I had written some of the notes in the margins myself in my own handwriting, so I would remember the specific details when the time came. The house was quiet now. Philip and Sonia had gone to bed. I could hear the low sound of the television through their closed door. They were using the guest room, which they had started calling the spare room about a year ago, as if renaming things was the first step to owning them. I thought about the retirement facility. I had heard Philip mention it once before 2 months ago, in a conversation he did not know I could hear. A place owned by his cousin Warren. Warren, who ran 3 facilities in the county and had recently expanded into a 4th. I had looked it up afterward. The rooms were clean. The brochure used words like comfortable transition and supported independence. The monthly cost was substantial. I thought about what that cost would mean, paid from my accounts month after month. I thought about what happened to a house when its owner was moved into a facility and was no longer in a position to object to much of anything. Then I closed the folder, set it beside my lamp, and picked up my phone. It was late. But my attorney Bernard picks up when I call. He always has. Bernard Osei has been my attorney for 19 years. He handled Gerald's estate after the funeral. He helped me set up the trust 2 years later, when I had finished grieving enough to think clearly about the future. He is a quiet man who speaks in short sentences and never wastes a word, which is exactly what I needed then and exactly what I needed now. I told him what I had seen. The strangers in the living room. Gerald's desk. My mother's china. Lux. The phone call about the facility. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Has anyone presented you with documents to sign?" I told him not yet. He said, "Then we are still ahead of it." I asked him about the trust. He reminded me of what we had built into it 4 years ago, when I had told him I was not afraid of dying but I was afraid of being managed. The house and my primary assets were held in the trust. There was a clause, specific and enforceable, that stated any documented attempt to coerce or arrange my relocation without my written, witness consent would trigger an immediate asset review and freeze. No one knew that clause existed. I had never mentioned the trust to Sonia. Not because I was hiding it from her, but because it had never been relevant until now. Bernard said, "Are you ready to activate it if necessary?" I said I was not ready yet. I wanted to watch a little longer. I wanted to understand exactly what they were planning before I moved. Put the phone down. Through my window, another truck sat parked at the curb. I was in the kitchen the next morning when I heard the truck doors. Sonia was already outside, directing 2 more men toward the back of the house. Philip stood near the driveway, arms crossed, speaking on his phone with the quiet authority of a man finalizing arrangements. I made my tea and drank it standing at the kitchen window. Bernard had called me back at 7 that morning before either of them was awake. One sentence, the way he speaks. He said, "When you are ready, say the word and I will begin." I said, "Not yet. There are things you need to see all the way through before you interrupt them. Partial evidence tells a partial story." I had spent 31 years in this house learning patience from a man who said that a person who moves too quickly always leaves something important on the table. I watched Sonia from the window. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this for longer than a few days. She knew which rooms to start in. She knew which items to box and which to set aside for donation. She had a system. That told me the system had been rehearsed. Around mid-morning, the men carried a box through the front door. Small, brown, taped lightly at the top. Sonia walked behind them, glancing at her clipboard. She did not look up. I saw the corner of the box, the clasp of a chain visible through the fold. I set my tea down. My grandmother Chidinma came to this country with very little. She carried what mattered most around her neck, a thin gold chain holding a small hand-carved pendant, the shape of a bird with its wings open. In our language, the name for that bird means the one who returns home no matter how far she has traveled. It was not expensive. A jewelry appraiser once told me it was worth almost nothing in money. I thanked him and put it back in its box without explaining why I was smiling. Sonia knew about the necklace. She had tried to borrow it twice when she was a teenager, once for a school performance and once for a date. Ed said no both times. Not to be cruel, but because some things are not borrowed. They are held until they are passed on. I watched the donation box loaded into the truck. Sonia came back inside, smoothing down her jacket. I asked her about the box. She said it was just some old costume jewelry and odds and ends I never wore anymore. She said, "You never wear it anyway, Mom." It was sitting in a drawer. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "You're right." And I smiled. She looked slightly surprised by the smile, which told me she had been expecting resistance. I went back to my chair and picked up my book. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later. Call from a number I recognized immediately. Clarence Webb, director of the Abra Community Foundation. The same foundation I had been quietly funding for 12 years. Clarence sounded puzzled when I answered. He said they had received a donation drop-off that morning from someone using my family address. He said the items were being logged and he wanted to make sure everything was in order before processing them because several pieces carried our family name on old labels and he did not want to make an error. I told him not to process anything yet. I asked him to photograph every item and send them to me before any of it was moved. He said of course. He said he hoped everything was all right. I told him everything was fine and that I would explain when I had more to share. Clarence has run the Abra Foundation since its founding. He knows my name because for 12 years I have written quarterly checks that supported their youth mentorship programs. He knows my handwriting. He knows my family name. What he did not know, and what Sonia certainly did not know, was that the foundation's largest single private donor had been me. Sonia had chosen the Abra Foundation for the donation because it was reputable and nearby. She had not asked me which charities I was connected to. She had not asked me anything at all. By that afternoon, Clarence had sent me 41 photographs. Every item catalogued. The pendant necklace in its box. Gerald's silver cufflinks. 3 framed photographs. My mother's serving bowl. The carved bookends Gerald bought on our honeymoon. Each photograph was time-stamped. The donor name on the drop-off form was Sonia Adeyemi. I forwarded everything to Bernard. Bernard reviewed the photographs and the drop-off form that evening. He called me at 9 and spoke carefully, the way he does when the information is more serious than he initially expected. He said Sonia had donated property she had no legal authority to distribute. The trust documentation was clear. The items from the house, including all personal effects acquired during the marriage, were protected assets. She had not been granted power of attorney. She had not been listed as a trustee. She had no standing to remove, donate, or sell a single item from the property without my documented consent. He said the photographs from Clarence, time-stamped and labeled with Sonia's name, constituted documented evidence of unauthorized distribution of protected property. I asked him what that meant practically. He said it meant we had something concrete to work with. He said he would contact the bank the following morning to flag the secondary accounts for review based on the trust provisions. Not the primary accounts, not yet. Just the secondary joint access that Sonia had been added to 2 years ago for convenience purposes, so she could help with bill payments if I was ever traveling. I thanked him and we hung up. I made myself a cup of warm milk and sat in Gerald's chair, the old armchair in the corner of the bedroom that the men had not taken because it was too scuffed to seem worth anything. I sat in it for a long time. The next morning Sonia's phone rang at 8:30. I was in the garden. I heard her voice rise sharply from inside the house. Then the sound of her calling for Philip. The bank had suspended her joint access to my secondary accounts pending a trust compliance review. She came to find me in the garden with her phone still in her hand, her face tight. She said there must be a mistake. I told her I was sure the bank would sort it out. She said she needed access to those accounts to help me manage things and that this suspension was going to cause serious problems. I asked what kind of problems. She stopped. She looked at Philip, who had followed her outside and was standing near the rose bushes with his hands in his pockets. He said the suspension was poorly timed. He said it calmly the way he says most things, but I noticed his jaw was set in a way that told me the calmness was being maintained with some effort. I said I was sorry to hear the timing was inconvenient. Then I went inside to make breakfast. An hour later, a car pulled up that I did not recognize. A woman in a dark blazer stepped out and walked to my front door with a leather folder under her arm. She looked at the house the way people look at property when they are pricing it. She measured the porch with her eyes. She glanced at the roofline. Sonia appeared at the door before I could reach it. She spoke to the woman in a low voice. The woman glanced past Sonia and saw me standing in the hallway. Something shifted in her expression. I stepped forward and introduced myself as the homeowner. The woman looked at Sonia. Then she opened her folder and I saw my address printed at the top of the first page. Her name was Priya. She was a residential sales agent with a firm downtown. She was apologetic in the way that professionals are apologetic when they realize they have walked into something they were not fully briefed on. She said she had been contacted to do a preliminary market assessment of the property. She said she understood the family was exploring options. I asked her who had contacted her. She glanced at Sonia again. Sonia said quickly that it was just a preliminary inquiry. Just gathering information. Nothing had been decided. She was simply being practical, thinking ahead, making sure I had all my options clearly laid out. I said, "Show me the paperwork." Priya opened her folder with the discomfort of someone who wished she were somewhere else. The preliminary listing agreement was already drafted. Property address, estimated listing price, proposed timeline. The timeline showed a target listing date 6 weeks from that day. The signature line was blank. Mine had not yet been obtained. But the document itself had already been initiated by a secondary party. Sonia's initials sat in the bottom corner of page 2, in the small box labeled Authorizing Party. She had signed a document initiating the sale of my home without my knowledge and without legal authority to do so. Priya left within 10 minutes, taking her folder with her. She did not make eye contact with Sonia on the way out. I stood in my hallway and waited while Sonia tried to explain. Then my phone buzzed. Bernard's name on the screen. Bernard had already prepared the formal notice before I called him about Priya. He had drafted it the evening before based on the bank evidence and the donation photographs. The realtor's paperwork, which I photographed before Priya left and forwarded immediately, was the third piece he had been waiting for. He filed the notice that afternoon. It went to the trust's oversight institution, to the bank, and to a copy service that delivered a printed version to my address by 4 o'clock. The trust's coercion clause had been activated. The house could not be listed, sold, mortgaged, or transferred. All accounts connected to the trust were frozen pending a full compliance review. Any legal challenge to the freeze would require Sonia to produce documentation proving she had my written, witnessed consent for each action she had taken. She had no such documentation because no such consent had ever been given. I was in the garden when Sonia found me with the notice in her hand. She read it twice. I watched her eyes move across the page the second time more slowly than the first. Then she looked up at me. Her expression was not angry yet. It was something closer to disbelief. The look of a person who has pulled a thread and discovered the fabric is not what they thought it was. Philip appeared behind her. He read the notice over her shoulder. His face went very still. Then he looked at Sonia with an expression I recognized immediately. I had seen it before in difficult situations. It was the expression of a man calculating how much of what went wrong was someone else's fault. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour and covered a great deal of ground without arriving anywhere useful. Sonia said I had misunderstood everything. She said they had been trying to help me. She said the items given to charity were ones she genuinely believed I had no use for. She said the realtor was simply providing information and that no decision had been made. She said the retirement facility was only being considered as a future option, a backup plan, something responsible families research rather than ignore. Philip said I was being paranoid. He used that word specifically. He said I had taken reasonable family planning and interpreted it as something threatening, which was itself a sign that perhaps some additional support would be beneficial. I let them speak. Then I picked up my phone and opened the photograph Clarence had sent me of the donation form. I placed my phone on the table facing up so they could both see the image clearly. I said, "This is the retirement facility agreement. The one with both your signatures. The one dated 3 weeks ago." The facility agreement had come from Bernard, who had requested a copy through legal channels after Philip's cousin Warren confirmed the booking inquiry. It showed a room reserved, a projected move-in timeline, and both their names in the authorization section. The room had been reserved before anyone had mentioned a single word to me. The silence that followed was the kind that does not invite more talking. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was upset but because my mind was working through things methodically, the way it does when something large has shifted and needs to be understood fully. Bernard had sent me copies of emails the following morning. His contact at the bank's compliance office had flagged a communication thread as part of the account review. The emails were between Sonia and Philip, spanning 4 months. In them, they discussed the timeline for what Philip referred to as the transition. They discussed which family members to speak to in advance and what to tell them. They discussed the story they would use. The story was that I had been showing signs of confusion, forgetting appointments, misplacing things, becoming anxious and withdrawn. They had not yet involved a doctor, but they had discussed approaching my physician with their observations and requesting a cognitive assessment. Not because they believed I was declining, but because a documented assessment would support the transition narrative if anyone questioned the move later. I read this twice. Then I set my phone down and looked at the rose bushes through the window for a while. What hurt was not what they had planned. I had suspected much of it. What hurt was the 4 months. 4 months of sitting across from my daughter at this table, eating meals I cooked, watching the news together in the evening, asking about her children. 4 months of her knowing exactly what was coming while I did not. Then I picked up my phone again and called my cousin Nkechi. Nkechi had been receiving messages from Sonia for 3 weeks. Careful messages, concerned in tone, asking whether Nkechi had noticed anything worrying about me recently, whether I seemed forgetful, whether I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Nkechi told me this on the phone in her direct, unhesitating way. She said she had found the messages strange because nothing in her recent conversations with me had suggested anything of the sort, but she had not wanted to alarm me before she understood what was happening. She said 3 other relatives had received similar messages. My nephew Duro, my old friend Comfort, who has known me since we were both in our 20s, Gerald's younger sister Beezy, who lives an hour away and visits every few months. Each of them had been given the same impression, that I was struggling, that the family was concerned, that arrangements were being made for my benefit. None of them had been told I knew nothing about those arrangements. Duro forwarded me the full message thread. He had screenshotted everything because, as he said, something about it had not sat right with him from the beginning. Called Comfort next. She was quiet for a moment when I finished explaining, and then she said something that made me feel less alone than I had felt in days. She said, "Adiz, I knew. I just could not say it." I told her I understood. Then I asked her to simply be honest if anyone else reached out to her. The next morning the charity posted online. The Abra Foundation had a practice of publicly thanking donors on their community page. Clarence had held off on posting while I asked him to, but once I confirmed the review was underway and the items were safely documented, I told him he could proceed with their normal process. The post went up on a Thursday. It thanked the Adeyemi family for a generous donation of household and personal items and included 2 photographs of the collection, neatly arranged on a receiving table. The comments came quickly. Several people from our neighborhood recognized the items. One woman commented that she thought she recognized the carved bookends from our home. Another asked whether we were moving. By Friday morning the post had been shared 11 times. Philip's business partner Raymond had apparently seen it, because Philip's demeanor changed noticeably that afternoon. He became quieter than usual. He took 3 phone calls in the back garden and came inside after each one looking like a man being asked questions he did not want to answer. Sonia did not know the foundation was connected to me until Clarence, responding to a question in the comments about whether the donation was intentional, posted a brief reply noting that the foundation had a long-standing relationship with the Adiz family and would ensure all items were treated with appropriate care. She came to find me in the kitchen after reading it. I was making rice. Kept stirring. Bernard sent me the financial summary on Saturday. He had been compiling it quietly for 2 weeks with the help of a forensic accountant connected to his firm. What the summary showed was not entirely surprising, but the scale of it was larger than I had assumed. Philip's construction company had been operating at a loss for 14 months. He had drawn down business credit lines to cover operational costs. There were 2 outstanding supplier disputes. The most urgent debt was a bridging loan taken against projected future earnings, with a repayment date arriving in 9 weeks. The projected future earnings that the loan had been secured against were according to the loan application, expected to come from the settlement of a family estate. My estate, while I was still living in it. Bernard said this quietly and then waited for me to respond. I asked him to confirm that Philip had listed anticipated proceeds from my property as collateral on a commercial loan without my knowledge, and without any legal basis for assuming those proceeds would materialize. Bernard said that was an accurate summary. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Philip at my dining table over the past several months. His careful questions about property values in the neighborhood. His offhand comments about how large the house was for one person. His gentle suggestions that perhaps I might find something smaller more manageable. Each comment had seemed isolated at the time. Together they formed a shape I could now see clearly. There was something even larger underneath it. Bernard had found it that afternoon. The loan application had been processed through a broker. The broker had submitted it to a commercial lender with supporting documentation. One of the supporting documents was a projected asset liquidation schedule. The schedule listed my house by address and estimated market value. It listed my secondary accounts by approximate balance. It listed a timeline for each asset to become available, built around a projected transfer of residence, meaning my move to Warren's facility. Bernard said the lender had not yet disbursed the full amount. Only an initial tranche had been released. But the application had been accepted, and the full loan was contingent on the liquidation schedule proceeding as documented. When the bank freeze triggered and the trust compliance review began, the lender's risk department flagged the file. They had scheduled a fraud review meeting, because a loan application that includes assets the applicant does not legally control, built around a timeline the asset owner has not consented to, is not a complicated situation for a fraud examiner to assess. I asked Bernard how serious this was for Philip. He said it depended on how the fraud examination concluded and whether the lender decided to pursue it formally. He said at minimum the loan would be recalled. At maximum, the fraud documentation could be referred to the Financial Crimes Unit. He said, "He used your house as a financial instrument without your knowledge. That has a name." That evening, Sonia came to my room and knocked lightly on the door. She came alone. Philip's car was still in the driveway, but she came to my door without him, which told me she had made a decision about how to approach this without consulting him first. That was new. She sat down in the chair near the window, the one Gerald used to read in on Sunday mornings, and looked at her hands for a while before she spoke. She said she knew things had gone further than they should have. She said she had told herself at the beginning that everything was for my benefit, that she genuinely thought a smaller place would be easier for me, that she had not realized how far Philip had taken things on the financial side until recently. I listened. She said she had not known about the loan application. She said she had found out 3 days ago when Philip let something slip under pressure, and she had pushed until he explained. She said she was not sure she believed herself when she said she had not known, because she had asked herself many times in recent days whether she had chosen not to know. Her voice was steady but her hands were not. I said, "You let your husband plan my removal from my own house and you carried the clipboard." She did not respond to that immediately. She looked out the window. Then she said, "I thought you would come around. I thought once it was done you would be relieved." I asked her one question. I said, "By erasing me?" She did not answer. She covered her mouth with one hand and looked at the floor. She cried for a while. I sat across from her and let her. I have known Sonia for 42 years. I carried her. I sat beside her hospital bed when she had pneumonia at age 7. I drove 4 hours in a January snowstorm to be at her side when her first marriage ended. I know the difference between her tears of manipulation and her tears of genuine reckoning. These were the second kind. The kind that come when a person sees themselves clearly for the first time in a long while and does not like what they find. When she was calmer, she said she wanted to fix it. She said she would speak to Philip. She said she would tell him to cooperate with the bank review and the fraud examination, and that she would not stand beside him if he chose not to. I told her fixing it was not simply a matter of intention. Intentions had brought us to this point. I told her that I was willing to consider restoring limited access to the secondary accounts once the trust review was complete. I was willing to allow the family relationship to continue. But there was a condition. A legal condition, not a personal one. She would need to sign a formal acknowledgement of coercion, drawn up by Bernard, confirming that the relocation plan had been pursued without my consent and relinquishing any future attempt to arrange or influence decisions about my residence, finances, or medical care without my explicit written agreement. She nodded slowly. I said, "Take the night. Think carefully." She came back the following morning before Philip was awake. She said she had decided. She said she would sign whatever Bernard prepared. I told her I was glad. Then she said Philip had been awake most of the night. That he had come to her around 2 in the morning and told her he would not sign anything. He said a legal acknowledgement was an admission, and an admission could be used against him in the fraud review. He said she was being naive. He said if she signed without him, it would be used to isolate him, and she would regret choosing her mother over her marriage. She told me this with a very quiet voice and a very straight back. I looked at her and said, "What did you say to him?" She said she had told him she would make her own decision. I called Bernard. He prepared the document that afternoon. Sonia came to his office at 4 o'clock and signed it with 2 witnesses present. Bernard notarized it and filed a copy with the trust records. Philip did not go with her. He was not present. By evening he had moved into the guest room. Not my guest room. He drove away with a bag while Sonia sat in my kitchen and I made us both tea. We did not talk about him. We talked about her children, my grandchildren, and whether the hydrangeas along the back fence needed to be cut back before winter. The fraud review continued without him. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Drama had already done its work. What came next was quieter. The methodical work of consequence arriving at its destination. The lender recalled the loan. Philip's broker had his license reviewed by the regulatory board following a referral from the fraud examiner. The outstanding supplier disputes against Philip's company could no longer be deferred, because without the projected asset proceeds, the payment structures he had promised were not viable. Sonia received a call from Philip's attorney on a Wednesday afternoon. The call was brief. Philip was requesting a separation period to manage the financial investigation without it complicating matters further between them. His attorney used careful language. Sonia listened, thanked the attorney and ended the call. She came to find me in the garden afterward. She did not look devastated. She looked like a woman who had been bracing herself for something for long enough that the arrival of it was almost a relief. She said, "He moved out this morning. I wasn't there." He nodded. She sat on the garden bench and looked at the roses. After a while she said, "I keep thinking about when I signed those papers at the facility. His cousin Warren called me a few weeks ago and asked what I wanted to do about the reservation. I cancelled it. I asked her when she had signed the facility papers originally. She said it was 3 months ago. Before the auction. Before the locks. Before any of it had started moving. Then she said, I think I knew it was wrong the whole time. There was something she had not yet told me. Something she had found while going through Philip's files the evening before. She hesitated before bringing it up, as if she was still deciding whether I could hear it without it changing something between us. She had found the insurance documents in Philip's home office filing cabinet, in a folder labeled simply with my initials. She brought them to me in a sealed envelope and sat across from me at the kitchen table while I opened it. The document was a copy of a life insurance policy I had taken out 14 years ago, shortly after Gerald died, when Bernard had advised me to review all my financial arrangements. The policy was substantial. The listed beneficiary was Sonia, not Philip, not a joint holding. Sonia's name only, in the original documentation I had signed with Bernard present. She had not known this policy existed. Philip apparently had found out about it through some financial inquiry connected to the loan application research. He had made a copy and kept it in his private files. She read the document slowly. Then she looked up at me. She said, You never changed this. I said, Why would I? she said. Even after everything. Even after I came in with the clipboard. I said, that was last month. The policy is 14 years old, Sonia. I made that decision when you were still someone I was building a future for. I did not unmake it because you made a serious mistake. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. I said, I was never your enemy. I was the obstacle your husband needed me to be. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she asked me a question I had not expected. She said, did you know what was happening the whole time? I said, from the moment I came through the front door. She confronted Philip the following weekend. She drove to the apartment where he was staying and sat across from him in a rented living room and asked him directly whether he had known about the insurance policy before the plan began. He admitted it. He said he had come across a reference to it in a bank document he had no real business reading, but that he had not acted on the information directly, that the policy had not factored into the planning in the way she was suggesting. She said she had not suggested anything yet. He said he had seen an opportunity to solve a problem and had let himself believe it was also the right thing for the family. He said he had genuinely thought I might be better off with more support around me. He said it with the voice of a man who has been telling himself a version of something for so long that he is no longer sure where the telling ends and the believing begins. She said he had written her mother's name into a loan application as an asset to be liquidated. He did not have an answer for that. She said he had reserved a room at a facility and signed both their names without telling her what the room would mean in practical terms. He said he thought she understood. She said she had not understood because he had never explained it clearly and she had chosen not to press him because it had been easier not to know. Then she said, I am the one who carried the clipboard. She told me this part on the phone. Her voice was steady. She said she had told him she was not willing to rebuild on a foundation that required her to be dishonest about what had happened. She said she had told him she would speak to a divorce attorney the following week. She asked if she could stay with me for a while. I said of course. She brought the necklace back on a Sunday morning. Clarence had held it separately from the other donated items at my request, keeping it in his office rather than the general inventory. He had done this without being asked to explain why. That is the kind of person he is. She drove to the foundation, collected it from Clarence personally, and came home with it in its original box, tied with the same ribbon I had kept around it for 20 years. She placed it on the kitchen table in front of me without saying anything at first. Then she said, Clarence told me you've been funding the foundation for 12 years. Said yes. She said, you donated the land for their community garden in 2019. Said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I chose them because I thought they were a good charity. I had no idea. I told her that was not a coincidence I had arranged. I had not foreseen my grandmother's necklace ending up in their donation bay. But when it did, the foundation knew exactly who to call. She said, I forgot who you were. I picked up the necklace and held it in my palm. The small carved bird with its wings open. The one who returns home no matter how far she has traveled. I looked at my daughter and said, no, you underestimated me. There was a long silence between us. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind that comes after something has been said that does not need to be added to. Several months have passed since that Sunday morning. Bernard restructured the trust with 3 additional protective clauses. The documentation is now more specific than before, which Bernard says is how good legal protection works. Titans with experience. The house is mine. Has always been mine. The locks were changed again in October. The good heavy ones I chose myself from the hardware store, and I kept both sets of spare keys this time in a place I selected. Philip's business entered administration in November. The fraud examination concluded without criminal referral, largely because he cooperated and because the loan had not fully disbursed. His cousin Warren wrote me a letter, which I did not reply to. Sonia is still staying in the guest room. We have not decided whether that arrangement is permanent or temporary, and we have agreed not to force the decision before it is ready to be made. She makes coffee in the mornings and we drink it on the back porch and talk about her children and her plans and sometimes about Gerald, who she misses more than she has admitted to anyone for a long time. Her divorce attorney filed the initial papers in December. She is not devastated. She is someone doing the work of understanding how she arrived somewhere she did not intend to go. That is its own kind of strength. I wear my grandmother's necklace on Sundays now. The little carved bird against my chest. The one who comes home. Gerald's armchair is still in the corner of my bedroom. The desk is gone, taken the day all of this began, and I have not replaced it. The space where it stood is still empty. I have decided to leave it that way for now. Not because I am sad about it, but because I want to remember what the room looks like when something has been taken that should not have been. So that I never confuse emptiness for simplicity again. When people ask me why I did not stop her that first day, why I stood aside and let them carry Gerald's desk out my front door, I tell them the truth. Sometimes you let people empty your shelves so you can see exactly what they were trying to take. I am not something you give away. And this house, with its rose bushes and its empty space and its Sunday mornings and its spare keys, is not something you simplify. It is mine.